Hello, this is volume 2, chapter 3 of Pride and Prejudice, or it's chapter 26 for those of you who have a book that is not divided into volumes. Mrs. Gardner's caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given on the first favorable opportunity of speaking to her alone. After honestly telling her what she thought, she thus went on. You are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it, and therefore I'm not afraid of speaking openly. She's like, you know what? I know you're cool. I know you can take my advice, and you're not going to just do the opposite of what I say just because you're kind of a jerk. You're not a jerk. Seriously, I would have you be on your guard. Do not involve yourself or endeavor to involve him in an affection which the want of fortune would make so very imprudent. So basically saying don't fall or don't encourage a relationship with someone or with Wickham if y'all are always going to be wanting money because or needing money because you're both poor. I have nothing to say against him. He is a most interesting young man, and if he had the fortune he ought to have, I should think he could not do better. But as it is, you must not let your fancy run away with you. You have sense, and we all expect you to use it. Your father would depend on your resolution and good conduct, I'm sure. You must not disappoint your father. So, her aunt, Elizabeth's aunt, Mrs. Gardner, is telling Elizabeth, like, hey, you know what? You need to use your head. Don't go and encourage Mr. Wickham and to have a relationship with you because y'all are both poor. Like, your dad would be upset about that. Like, we expect you to use your brain, and don't do that. My dear aunt, this is being serious indeed. Yes, and I hope to engage you to be serious likewise. Sounds like Elizabeth's being playful a little bit, right? Well, then, you need not be under any alarm. I will take care of myself and of Mr. Wickham too. He shall not be in love with me if I can prevent it. Elizabeth, you are not serious now. I beg your pardon. I will try again. At present, I am not in love with Mr. Wickham. No, I certainly am not, but he is, beyond all comparison, the most agreeable man I ever saw. And if he becomes really attached to me, I would believe it will be better that he should not. I see the imprudence of it. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy! My father's opinion of me does me the greatest honor, and I should be miserable to forfeit it. My father, however, is partial to Mr. Wickham. In short, my dear aunt, I should be very sorry to be the means of making any of you unhappy, but since we see every day that where there is affection, young people are seldom withheld by immediate want of fortune from entering into engagements with each other. How can I promise to be wiser than so many of my fellow creatures if I'm tempted? Or am I even to know that it would be wisdom to resist? She's like, you know what, everybody else my age doesn't care about that kind of stuff. Like, why should I care? And am I, how do I know that I'm being wise and rejecting, a relationship with Mr. Wickham? Is that really the right or wrong thing to do? All that I can promise you, therefore, is to not be in a hurry. I will not be in a hurry to believe myself his first object. When I am in company with him, I will not be wishing. In short, I will do my best. So Elizabeth's basically saying, you know what? We're not in love right now. I don't know. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen, but it could. I'm not making any promises, Aunt Gardner. Or Thea, right? So perhaps it will be as well if you discourage his coming here so very often. At least you should not remind your mother of inviting him. As I did the other day, said Elizabeth with a conscious smile. Very true. It will be wise in me to refrain from that. But do not imagine that he is always here so often. It is on your account that he has been so frequently invited this week. She's like, yeah, I know. I shouldn't be inviting him over. She's like, but he's here because of you. You know my mother's ideas as to the necessity of constant company for her friends, but really, and upon my honor, I will try to do what I think to be wisest, and now I hope you are satisfied. Her aunt assured her that she was, and Elizabeth, having thanked her for the kindness of her hints, they parted, a wonderful instance of advice being given on such a point without being resented. So Elizabeth did not resent her aunt for kind of like butting in, I guess, and giving her some advice that maybe Elizabeth didn't want to hear, because I think Elizabeth does like Wickham. She may not be in love with him and he's not in love with her, but I mean, I think she was open to the idea of it. So Mr. Collins returned to Hertfordshire soon after it had been quitted by the Gardners and Jane, but as he took up his abode with the Lucases, his arrival was no great inconvenience to Mrs. Bennet. His marriage was now fast approaching, and she was at length so far resigned as to think it inevitable, and even repeatedly to say in an ill-natured tone that she wished they might be happy. So, Mr. Collins came back, but he didn't stay with the Bennets. He stayed with the Lucases because, I mean, he's going to get married to Charlotte. So they allowed him to stay at their home. And so Mrs. Bennet's like, ugh, I guess. Thursday was to be the wedding day, and on Wednesday, Miss Lucas paid her farewell visit. And when she rose to take leave, Elizabeth, ashamed of her mother's ungracious and reluctant good wishes and sincerely affected herself, accompanied her out of the room, and they went downstairs together. Charlotte said, I shall depend on hearing from you very often, Eliza. That you certainly shall. And I have another favor to ask. Will you come and see me? We shall often meet, I hope, in Hertfordshire. I am not likely to leave Kent for some time. Promise me, therefore, to come to Hunsford. Elizabeth could not refuse, though she foresaw little pleasure in the visit. So Charlotte went to say goodbye, because she was getting married the next day, and she just wanted to say bye to all her friends because she's moving, she's leaving. And Mrs. Bennet wasn't being very nice about it. She was kind of being bitter because we know that Mrs. Bennet wanted Mr. Collins to marry one of her daughters, but she's not. I mean, he's not. And so now Charlotte is asking Elizabeth to write to her and also to visit. And Elizabeth's like, I don't think that's a good idea, but yeah, sure. My father and Maria are to come to me in March, added Charlotte, and I hope you will consent to be of the party. Indeed, Eliza, you will be as welcome to me as either of them. The wedding took place. The bride and bridegroom set off for Kent from the church door, and everybody had as much to say or to hear on the subject as usual. Elizabeth soon heard from her friend, because they're writing to each other. And their correspondence, which is their letter writing, was as regular and frequent as it had ever been. That it should be equally unreserved was impossible. Elizabeth could never address her without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over. And though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been rather than what was. So Elizabeth's like, yeah, I can't talk to her the way I used to. There's no way. I don't feel the same about her, because of how she agreed to marry Mr. Collins. Like, he's such a goofball. Who would marry him? She's like, maybe I thought wrongly about her, right? And so she still wrote to Charlotte often just because, she valued the kind of friendship they had before and not what they have now. Charlotte's first letters were received with a good deal of eagerness. There could not but be curiosity to know how she would speak of her new home, how she would like Lady Catherine, and how happy she would dare pronounce herself to be. Though when the letters were read, Elizabeth felt that Charlotte expressed herself on every point exactly as she might have foreseen. She wrote cheerfully, seemed surrounded with comforts, and mentioned nothing which she could not praise. The house, the furniture, neighborhood, and roads were all to her taste, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly and obliging. It was Mr. Collins's picture of Hunsford and Rosings rationally softened, and Elizabeth perceived that she must wait for her own visit there to know the rest. So Elizabeth, when she got Charlotte's letters, or her first letters, she was like, oh yeah, I need to read this to see what's going on. I need to see if there's a hint of dissatisfaction from Charlotte. And there's not. And so she's like, I don't know if this is real. I need to go visit her myself to find out. So Jane had already written a few lines to her sister to announce her safe arrival in London, because remember, Jane left with her aunt and uncle to London, to help her get over Bingley. But we know Bingley is in London, and his sister too, and Darcy, or his sisters are, and Darcy, right? And when she wrote again, Elizabeth hoped it would be in her power to say something of the Bingleys. Her impatience for this second letter was well rewarded, as impatience generally is. Jane had been a week in town without either seeing or hearing from Caroline. She accounted for it, however, by supposing that her last letter to her friend from Longbourn had by some accident been lost. So Jane's been there a week, and according to decorum, Caroline Bingley should go and visit Jane. She knows that Jane's there. Jane told her in a letter, I can't remember how, but she knows. My aunt, she continued, is going tomorrow into that part of town, and I shall take the opportunity of calling in Grosvenor Street. She wrote again when the visit was paid, so Jane's like, oh, well, maybe my letter was lost, so I guess I'll go visit her first. Right? So now here's another letter telling Elizabeth what happened after that. She wrote again when the visit was paid, and she had seen Miss Bingley. I did not think Caroline in spirits, were her words, but she was very glad to see me and reproached me for giving her no notice of my coming to London. I was right, therefore. My last letter had never reached her. I inquired after their brother, of course. He was well, but so much engaged with Mr. Darcy that they scarcely ever saw him. I found that Miss Darcy was expected to dinner. I wish I could see her. My visit was not long, as Caroline and Mrs. Hurst were going out. I dare say I shall soon see them here. So, Caroline didn't visit Jane, so Jane's like, well, I'll go to them. When she was there, Miss Bingley, or Caroline Bingley, was like, oh, I didn't know you were here. She played stupid, right? And so then they kind of like shushed her out, saying, oh, no, we're going somewhere. You got to go. Sorry. So now Caroline's, okay, I'm sorry. Jane's like, oh, okay, so I went to visit. Now they know for sure that I'm here. So now I expect them to come visit me next, according to the rules of decorum, right? Elizabeth shook her head over this letter. It convinced her that accident only could discover to Mr. Bingley her sister's being in town. Elizabeth's like, yeah, no, they're not going to tell Bingley that Jane's there. There's no way. 4 weeks passed away, and Jane saw nothing of him. She endeavored to persuade herself that she did not regret it, but she could no longer be blind to Miss Bingley's inattention. So now she's like, yeah, I think you're right, Elizabeth, about Miss Bingley. So after waiting at home every morning for a fortnight, that's 2 weeks, and inventing every evening a fresh excuse for her, the visitor did at last appear, but the shortness of her stay, and yet more the alteration of her manner, would allow Jane to deceive herself no longer. The letter which she wrote on this occasion to her sister will prove what she felt. So Jane's like, yeah, she didn't come see me for 2 weeks. That's a long time. No, Caroline does know that Jane is there. She didn't go visit for 2 weeks. And when she did, she was like in an altered state, I guess. I mean, not the way she looks, but her manner. And she writes about it in the letter to Lizzie. My dearest Lizzie will, I am sure, be incapable of triumphing in her better judgment at my expense when I confess myself to have been entirely deceived by Miss Bingley's regard for me. She was like, gosh, I was tricked. Not tricked, but more like I was mistaken. I really thought that Miss Bingley liked me, But my dear sister, though the event has proved you right, do not think me obstinate if I still assert that, considering what her behavior was, my confidence was as natural as your suspicion. I do not at all comprehend her reason for wishing to be intimate with me, but if the same circumstances were to happen again, I am sure I should be deceived again. She's like, I don't understand. Like, why did she want to be friends with me in the first place? She's the one who wanted to be friends. And if that were to happen again, like the same situation of Caroline and Jane meeting and becoming friends, she's like, if that were to happen again, I think I'd fall for it again. It was so real. Caroline did not return my visit till yesterday, and not a note, not a line did I receive in the meantime. When she did come, it was very evident that she had no pleasure in it. She made a slight formal apology for not calling before, said not a word of wishing to see me again, and was in every respect so altered a creature that when she went away, I was perfectly resolved to continue the acquaintance no longer. So even Jane's like, whoa, that was crazy. Her attitude towards me is so different. She's like, that's it. We just can't be friends. I pity, though, I cannot help blaming her. She was very wrong in singling me out as she did. I can safely say that every advance to intimacy began on her side. So she's like, yeah, no, it was her. It was Caroline who wanted to be friends with me, and she's the one who sought me out, right? But I pity her because she must feel that she has been acting wrong. And because I am very sure that anxiety for her brother is the cause of it. She's like, well, I mean, I know Caroline must know that she's being mean, right? I need not explain myself further, and though we know this anxiety to be quite needless, yet if she feels it, it will easily account for her behavior to me. And so deservedly dear as he is to his sister, Whatever anxiety she may feel on his behalf is natural and amiable. She's like, well, maybe she's just watching out for her brother for some reason. I mean, she loves his brother, and I just don't understand. I cannot but wonder, however, at her having any such fears now, because if he had at all cared about me, we must have met long ago. He knows of my being in town, I am certain, from something she said herself, and yet it should seem by her manner of talking as if she wanted to persuade herself that he really is partial to Miss Darcy. She's like, I don't know why she's, worried about her brother. I mean, he obviously doesn't really like me the way we thought he did. So why is she upset? I cannot understand it. If I were not afraid of judging harshly, I should be almost tempted to say that there is a strong appearance of duplicity in all this. She's like, oh my gosh, I think she might be a two-face. But I will endeavor to banish every painful thought and think only of what will make me happy, your affection and the invariable kindness of my dear aunt and uncle. Let me hear from you very soon. Miss Bingley said something of his never returning to Netherfield again, of giving up the house, but not with any certainty. We had better not mention it. I am extremely glad that you have such pleasant accounts from our friend in Hunsford. Pray go see them when with Sir William and Maria. I am sure you will be very comfortable there. Yours, etc., Jane. Right. So at the end, she's saying, hey, Charlotte invited you over. I read that in your last letter. She's like, you should go. I think it's good for you. So this letter gave Elizabeth some pain, but her spirits returned as she considered that Jane would no longer be duped, by the sister at least. All expectation from the brother was now absolutely over. She was like, yeah, Jane does not expect Bingley to really care for her. Where am I? All expectation from the brother was now absolutely over. She would not even wish for any renewal of his attentions. His character sunk on every review of it, and as a punishment for him as well as a possible advantage to Jane, she seriously hoped he might really soon marry Mr. Darcy's sister, as, by Wickham's account, she would make him abundantly regret what he had thrown away. She's like, well, maybe it's even better that maybe he should get married to Miss Darcy. So it'll just put an end to everything in Jane's mind. It'll be absolutely finished, and she won't even, from here on out, she can only just get over him, and not hope at all ever again. Mrs. Gardiner, about this time, reminded Elizabeth of her promise concerning that gentleman and required information. Okay, so Mrs. Gardiner wants to know more about Wickham, right? And Elizabeth had such to send as might rather give contentment to her aunt than to herself. His apparent partiality had subsided. His attentions were over. He was the admirer of someone else. So that was her news about Wickham to Mrs. Gardiner. She's like, yeah, he likes somebody else. He kind of ditched me. Elizabeth was watchful enough to see it all, but she could see it and write of it without material pain. Well, good. Her heart had been but slightly touched, and her vanity was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice had fortune permitted it. The sudden acquisition of £10,000 was the most remarkable charm of the young lady to whom he was now rendering himself agreeable. So now he's trying to court this other lady or other girl who just inherited a lot of money. She's like, yeah, I get it. Elizabeth, I get it. I don't have any money. This other girl does, so I get it, why he would rather go flirt with her and be with her than me. But Elizabeth, less clear-sighted perhaps in his case than in Charlotte's, did not quarrel with him for his wish of independence. Did you hear that? Let me read that again. But Elizabeth, less clear-sighted perhaps in his case than in Charlotte's, did not quarrel with him for his wish of independence, because his case and Charlotte's case are basically the same. He ditched Elizabeth because he wants to go and be with a girl who has money. He needs money to survive, right? Well, Charlotte did the same thing. She went with Mr. Collins because he has money and he can take care of her because she needs to survive. But she was so harsh on Charlotte. Why isn't she being harsh to Mr. Wickham? That's why it's saying, here, let me read that again. But Elizabeth, less clear-sighted perhaps in his case than in Charlotte's, did not quarrel with him for his wish of independence. Anyway, nothing on the contrary could be more natural. And while able to suppose that it cost him a few struggles to relinquish her, she was ready to allow it a wise and desirable measure for both, and could very sincerely wish him happy. Really? Why can't she do that for Charlotte? You know? All this was acknowledged to Mrs. Gardiner, and after relating the circumstances, she thus went on. I am now convinced, my dear aunt, that I have never been much in love, for had I really experienced that pure and elevating passion, I should at present detest his very name, and wish him all manner of evil. She's like, well, I guess I didn't love him, because if I did, I guess my feelings would be more hurt, and they're not. But my feelings are not only cordial towards him, they are even impartial towards Miss King. That's the name of the girl that Wickham is now trying to date. I cannot find out that I hate her at all, or that I am in the least unwilling to think her a very good sort of girl. There can be no love in all this. My watchfulness has been effectual, and though I should certainly be a more interesting object to all my acquaintance, were I distractedly in love with him, I cannot say that I regret my comparative insignificance. She's like, well, you know, I guess it would be an experience to have my heart broken, and I'd be a little different from everybody else, but I guess not. Importance may sometimes be purchased too dearly. So she's saying that she may be a little insignificant right now because she hasn't experienced that. And she's saying, well, if she were to feel that, it would be purchased too dearly. Like she'd have to give up a little bit of herself, meaning that she would have a broken heart, right? But she doesn't, thank goodness. Kitty and Lydia take his defection much more to heart than I do. They are young in the ways of the world, and do not yet open to the mortifying conviction that handsome young men must have something to live on as well as the plain. So Lydia and Kitty feel worse than Elizabeth does about Wickham going on with somebody else, or with Miss King.